Michelle, would you like to give it a minute or two just to have some more attendees join us before we kick off? All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jessie Hurst. I serve as the Internal Relations Executive for the USB Consulting Club. And it's a great privilege to extend a very warm welcome to our guest speaker, Hendrik Malan, the CEO of Frost & Sullivan Africa. Hendrik, thank you very much for joining us today. We were in fact scheduled to host Hendrik towards the end of last year, which got postponed due to unplanned events. So we are excited to finally have this opportunity to learn more about Frost & Sullivan, the work that they're doing, and also how Hendrik and his team are tackling the post-COVID challenges. I also want to extend a big welcome to all the attendees who've dialed in for today's webinar. A big hello and welcome to all the first-time attendees who've not yet joined our club. And also a big hello and welcome back to our consulting club members joining us today. For those of you who are new here and would like to learn some more about the consulting club, please get in touch with us for more information. My colleague Tammy will be posting our contact details in the chat function shortly. Also, a big thank you to the USB support team for our webinar today. We really do appreciate your assistance. So for today's event, we will kick off with an introduction of Hendrik and Frost & Sullivan, followed by Hendrik's presentation where he will be sharing insights on management consulting in a post-COVID world. We encourage you to please raise any questions as we continue that you might have with Hendrik, as well as any general questions towards the end of the presentation. If you don't feel comfortable raising them directly, please share them in the chat function, and we will close off the session with that discussion. So with that, Michelle, I will hand over to you for introduction.
Thank you, Jessie, and hello to everyone joining us this afternoon. So it is with great pleasure that I have the privilege of introducing today's guest speaker, Mr. Hendrik Malan, who is the partner and CEO of Frost & Sullivan Africa. And Hendrik has really honed his abilities to identify, qualify, strategize, and operationalize expansion opportunities over 25 years of practical experience in Africa. And by supporting dozens of companies on the continent and beyond in reaching their corporate growth objectives, Hendrik has really developed an in-depth understanding of how to take your organization to the next level, despite the challenges of this exciting region. So with a true passion for Africa and its people, Hendrik loves leading companies and teams to grow and expand commercially by taking advantage of the wealth of regional and global opportunities. Hendrik, on behalf of the USB Consulting Club Exco and members, I would like to say thank you for taking the time to engage with us today. I personally am really looking forward to learning more about Frost & Sullivan Africa and also hearing what you will share with us today on the topic at hand. So without further delay, I would like to hand the floor over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Jessie. It's always a pleasure speaking to our colleagues at USB. Yeah, I was at University of Stellenbosch for my basic degree, so it's always nice to go returning back to the Stellenbosch roots. So let me just quickly share we'll start sharing my screen. So let's get the technical setup quickly done. Share. And then we're on presentation mode, so you should be seeing my screen. Everything up? All right, perfect. I've got a thumbs up. All right, so good afternoon, everybody. It's always a pleasure, like I said, speaking to the USB. We've had a very long and very good relationship with the University of Stellenbosch Business School. It's always a pleasure sort of speaking at your events as well, and very professional, very sort of well organized, and great candidates. We've been working with and recruiting from the USB talent pool for a very long period of time, ever since we set up shop directly in Africa as Frost & Sullivan. So we're here today to talk about the management consulting industry in a post-COVID world. So we're going to start off with a quick introduction to Frost & Sullivan, and we're doing that for two reasons. One is to provide you with some context, so sort of where are the comments coming from, sort of what kind of consultancy Frost & Sullivan is, and secondly, I need to get my little marketing spiel in, so wait for it. And then secondly, we're going to introduce some of the the basic refocus framework that we've used in order to help our clients sort of work through the initial stages of COVID. COVID is has obviously sort of created a lot of havoc in the commercial environment. It's far from over, which means that a lot of companies are still having to deal with the the current issues and challenges associated with the hard lockdown, the soft lockdown, the commercial issues, the supply chain issues, et cetera, So we've developed a very rudimentary framework in order to help companies cope. And the management consulting industry is no different. So we've used the same framework, and we've kind of eaten our own breakfast, making sure that we also go through the same exercise. We actually went through a very similar exercise about 9 months before COVID hit, which helped us a lot, to be a lot more flexible and a lot more adaptive. So we handled COVID, I think, relatively well compared to some of our colleagues, and I'll lift out some of the best practices and some of the things that I think we could have done a bit better during the course of the last sort of year, I guess. And then finally, we'll end off with a few comments just around the management consulting industry specifically and the expected changes post-COVID. I think the management consulting industry was already changing quite rapidly even before COVID. And the COVID has obviously accelerated a lot of those changes because of the pressure on the industry. So we're going to talk a bit about sort of some of the changes that we foresee are going to be accelerated, and some new changes that we are most likely going to see over the foreseeable future, so over the next sort of 1 to 5 years. I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to also ask questions in between. I'm going to introduce Frost. You can ask questions about Frost. I'm going to introduce the framework to you. You can ask us questions about the framework. And then, we're going to talk about the management consulting industry. You can ask us or ask me questions on the consulting industry, and then we're going to open up the floor. You can pretty much ask me anything you would like, either about the industry or about the South African or the African economy or the way that we work. Anything that's relevant, I guess, to the management consulting industry or the consulting club. Everything and anything would go. And Jessie will curate that for us, and she'll pass through the questions. Good stuff. All right, so shall we get stuck in? All right, so this is the little overview of Frost & Sullivan. I promise it's only one slide, so it's not going to be a long sort of marketing spiel. So Frost is a global market intelligence and strategy consulting firm. So it developed in the 60s in the US, initially as a pure play market intelligence firm, and then probably about 35 years ago started moving into the strategy consulting space. So because they had a very good understanding of the dynamics of typically quite complex industries like defense and healthcare, information communication technology, the aerospace industry, it put them in a relatively good position to start making recommendations around growth and expansion. And they started using that intelligence to make recommendations to companies about how to take advantage of some of these opportunities. So in addition to just pointing them out or just identifying opportunities just in general, they started making recommendations on how to approach these opportunities in the commercial environment, how to position themselves from a competitive perspective. And it led to a full-fledged consulting division, which now makes up just over 50% of global revenues. The company's been around, like I said, for now actually almost 60 years. I think in the next year, next year we're celebrating the 60th year of Frost & Sullivan. 45 locations around the world, which in our environment is very important. I mean, Frost operates in a very integrated fashion. So at any given moment, my team would be on 2-3 different global projects, and vice versa, in order to provide clients with the best possible local understanding. So we do not execute on projects in Brazil. The Brazilian team executes on the project in Brazil. The North American team doesn't execute on projects in Nigeria. We execute on projects in Nigeria because it falls under our remit within Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's important because, our understanding of the dynamics in China or in Japan, or in Poland wouldn't be as strong as somebody, that operates in that environment sort of day in and day out. So we try to give our clients the best possible value and the best possible understanding and the best possible recommendations, based on the local context, but we bring the global expertise to the table. So I can tap into, your circular economy expertise. Fred sits on London. He's been in that space for the last 15 years. I can tap into special economic zone expertise in Singapore with Abinit, because he's been in that space for the last 15 years. So, the integrated nature of Frost makes it a very good organization to deal with, because of the global perspective that we bring and the local context that we have. We've got a proactive focus on 12 industries. You know, the management consulting industry has got a tendency of kind of flip-flopping between either a vertical focus or a functional focus. Frost has always had a vertical focus because of the market intelligence roots. I enjoy the vertical focus for the simple reason that we bring a lot of understanding to the table even before we've started engaging with the client. It doesn't take us, you know, 3-4 weeks in order to find our feet and get a good understanding of the industry. We typically bring a lot of value already to the conversation, you know, when we start engaging with the clients, which especially in recent times during and post-COVID, you know, we find particularly useful, and I'll spend a bit of time on that because I think it's probably one of the better things, you know, that we've been able to do during this challenging time, you know, for our clients. You know, but you know, the fact that we can bring value to the table even before we've actually engaged with any of the internal components or any of the internal team members, you know, is a big advantage from a business development perspective, because we've changed the way that the consulting industry, you know, does business development. You know, where traditionally it's based on very senior relationships managed over a long period of time. You know, we've changed it that it's actually focused on the value and the content, you know, that you build that relationship over a period of time, and not just with senior executives. Yeah, albeit that also plays an important role ultimately in the decision making. African operation, like I mentioned, established in 2005. They were servicing the region from outside up until that point. I joined them soon thereafter, so it was in December 2005. I joined them at the end of February 2006 to set up their consulting division at local level for Sub-Saharan Africa. I was working for Deloitte's innovation division at the time, and then came down here to Cape Town to set up shop, you know, for Frost and Sullivan, and yeah, never left. You know, so Cape Town is a really nice place to be, and I'm not going to go into the reasons why they set up shop in Cape Town. I didn't ask any questions, and we're still based down in Cape Town, albeit the fact that our majority of our clients in South Africa, in any case, yeah, are based in Johannesburg. You'll see the industries of focus here on the right-hand side: energy and power, you know, information and communication technology, the chemicals industry, healthcare, mobility, and then public sector and financial services being some of our major focus areas in Africa specifically. All right, so before we kind of move on to the you know, the framework, the Triple R framework, any questions on Frost at this particular point in time?
Hendrik, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet, but I actually have a question myself. Looking at the 6 Africa verticals, would you just mind repeating which 6 those are?
Sure. So energy and power supply, it's information and communication technology, it's healthcare, it's chemicals and materials, it's mobility, and then it is, we group business and financial services and public sector together, but I guess those are 2 separate industries. So public sector around economic development, and then business and financial services mainly around private equity and the banking industry.
Okay, and I might be jumping the gun a little bit here, but I was quite curious in terms of which of these industry verticals in Africa you are finding holds the most potential and challenges at the moment. But tell me if it's a bit soon for that question.
No, I mean, happy to kind of deal with this as we go through the presentation, because I think the environment is so complex at the moment that, I mean, everybody's trying to figure out heads from tails, and very importantly, I mentioned this later in the presentation, we're trying to figure out what is temporary and what is permanent. You know, what is going to be a longer term trend that we're going to have to deal with versus just kind of short term inertia. You know, the short term issues that people have got to deal with. You know, the industry that we feel that's most likely going to be hit the hardest is probably going to be the mobility industry. Apart from last mile delivery, you know, from a logistics perspective, that will do really, really well because of online sales and, you know, the digital economy developing exceptionally well, you know, just because of all the e-commerce, you know, elements. You know, logistics in general are doing not well. You know, the OEMs are not doing well at the moment. Motor vehicle sales are obviously down in the dumps. Second-hand vehicle sales are down in the dumps. You know, so the mobility industry in general, I think, you know, it's probably the industry that's going to be the worst hit. I've got a slide a bit later on, and I'll give you an indication of the industries that we feel are either going to be sort of, have a positive impact and then have a negative impact. So we actually rated it, based on one of the client engagements that we've got. We've got a little document that we've developed on the economic impacts at a sector level for South Africa that we foresee over the next 3 years. So that, whoever's interested are more than welcome to mail us, and we'll share that document with you as well. Over the coming weeks, we just sort of finalizing some of the elements, but it gives you an indication of at a sector level what we feel is probably going to advance and what will retract over the next 3 years in South Africa, because everybody's talking about individual industries, or they're talking about South Africa, but they're not comparing the various industries with each other. They're not taking a similar or a consistent approach across the various industries, which essentially is what our lead economist, Craig Parker, did, and he spent a good couple of weeks on doing the modeling, and he's very good at it. So we've pretty much done that process, and we're happy to share that with you.
Great, thank you.
Good stuff. All right, so then we get to the framework, the refocus framework. And it's a pretty rudimentary framework, right? So I had a comment from one of the colleagues saying, look, I mean, for a management consultant company, it's a pretty rudimentary framework that you guys developed. And we said, I mean, you're correct in that it's a really rudimentary framework, but I mean, given the chaos that our clients are having to deal with, you definitely don't want to spend the first hour explaining the model to your client, do you? The complexity that our clients have had to deal with from an operational perspective have been absolutely phenomenal, and we've had to be there, especially during the first, I guess, sort of 2-3 months of the pandemic. We've had to give our clients a tremendous amount of support without any financial remuneration attached to it in any shape or form. We had to essentially invest more in order to help our clients to get through this whole process. And one of the ways we did it was to take them through sort of the framework in order to try to classify the various ways of responding and refocusing the organization. Because the biggest challenge that we've had was that people were so stuck in survival mode that they weren't necessarily thinking about what next. And we were very much of the opinion from the word get-go that the crisis is far from over. The first lockdown was not going to be the last lockdown. This pandemic is not going to be the last pandemic. You're going to have to use the opportunity in order to ready your organization for the next pandemic and the pandemic after that and the pandemic after that. Your business model will have to change in order to make sure that your organization is flexible enough in order to be able to take these kind of hits. The supply chains and the value chains will have to incorporate some of the risk associated with where you are in that value chain. The production side, for instance, at the moment in agriculture, takes a disproportional amount of risk in the overall value chain, but they're not being remunerated for it. And hence we're seeing this massive amount of consolidation happening on the production side when we deal with agro-processing sort of projects, et cetera, which is not necessarily doing anybody any favors, because, they're mechanizing everything, the job creation component is going out the window. It's not serving the broader, the industry and the economic development purposes of any country necessarily, but they're not necessarily evaluating the risk associated with the different parts of the value chain, which they need to. And businesses need to do the same thing. The crisis is far from over. We're talking about the third wave hitting us in April at the moment. So my wife is in the industry, and the hospital that she's associated with, which I won't mention, is now pretty much at the same levels as the peak level of wave number 1. They were 3 times the level of COVID positive patients of the first wave, as part of the second wave. So they're talking about the third wave hitting us probably in around April this year. So we're going to have to deal with this through the course of 2021. And we don't know what the new variants of the virus is going to do. So it's far from over. You can't stick your head in the sand and kind of wait for everything to just pass, because those organizations either have already failed or they're about to start failing. You need to complement your response from an operational perspective with the future-looking responses, and it cannot be the same teams. And this is one of the things, and one of the fundamental mistakes that quite a lot of organizations made, is they took their executives and they dumped them on the operational part, the sort of the response and the emergency component, and they used them in order to figure out, look, what do they need to do next? And the worst thing that you can do is try to mix the executive team in order to try to figure out what to do on both sides of the fence. Yeah, because both elements require a clean-cut focus. So you need to complement your response with a focus on aligning with the organization for the new realities you'll face post the lockdown, post the initial parts in any case of the pandemic. So we developed a three part framework, which the first one is responding to the immediate challenges, right? So the operational issues, et cetera, resetting the current business, and then rebounding after that by populating the growth initiative pipeline. So the growth pipeline, the innovation pipeline, in order to make sure you reinvent the business, you reinvent the business models, the value chains and the supply chains in order to ready yourself for the future. And the intention of giving these presentations on an ongoing basis to our clients for a good 3-4 months was to help them move from a coping mindset to taking decisive action around how to deal with their business moving forward. We're trying to jerk them out of this whole panic mode and getting them to focus on the future in order to make sure that, yes, there is an element of we need to deal with this, right? So it's very real. It's a big issue and you've got to deal with it. And we'll talk about it just now in terms of what are some of the elements that we dealt with as well on behalf of our clients. But it's not the only thing you've got to deal with, because it's not just riding out the lockdown. It's not just riding out this wave. It's about changing the fundamentals of your organization to ready yourself for the future, to future-proof the organization, so to speak. So the first part of it is really the response part, which is kind of the obvious bit, right? So a lot of organizations are still busy with this. So, and you can see the CFO top of mind issues. It's a normal thing: cash, employee morale, sales pipelines that have to be shot, supply chains still disrupted. I mean, my house overlooks a big part of the Bay Area, and I can see the container vessels that are waiting, trying to get into the harbor. I mean, apart from the wind obviously playing quite a big role, COVID has also played a very significant role in the delays in loading and offloading some of the container vessels. Digital maturity, digital security, data democratization, all these things we had to deal with at a very quick level. I mean, one of my clients, one of the major oil companies, they've been talking about remote working for years, and the executive team was very much of the opinion that the organization wasn't mature enough. They weren't mature enough. They couldn't do remote working. And the particular executive that was pushing it said, well, then COVID happened, and then overnight we became mature, and then everybody worked from home, and everything was fine, right? So it pushed a lot of organizations into the next phase of development and the next phase of maturity. And it showed, I think, a lot of companies what the organization could actually achieve in a relatively short space of time. A lot of times we kick and scream against change, and we kick and scream against the things that we don't want to do because there's inertia, there's concern, there's risk associated or perceived risk associated behind it. But as soon as the crisis hits, we can use it in order to drive positive change within the organization. So the challenges range from the workforce elements, the disruptive supply chains, the cash preservation, which was a big issue. There were a lot of very strong responses. Some of the organizations had initially weak responses, and then 2-3 subsequent responses, which we don't typically like. Our preference is very much, if you do respond, if you do cut, you cut deep in order to make sure you create a sustainable platform that you do not have to cut and cut again, because the uncertainty that you create within the organization affects morale actually significantly worse than cutting and cutting again, than you cutting once and doing a proper job of it. Technology and data, people, processes, without going into too much detail, those were pretty much the 3 areas that we had to deal with. The technology and data component was a pretty big issue for a lot of organizations that weren't digitally mature. And the cybersecurity risk associated with that was absolutely immense. We were actually surprised that there weren't more significant cyber attacks that were published in any case during this period, because a lot of organizations were very vulnerable, I think, to cybersecurity challenges and risk during this period, because they had to make a very quick move to data democratization in order to get their workforce to be able to operate remotely. The people component, I mean, there are a number of elements to it, right? So, I mean, there's a employee engagement component to it. Yeah, there's a management component to it. I mean, we're going to have to deal going forward with things like employee onboarding remotely. How do you do that? I mean, normally you bring them to the office and there's an impartation element to it, et cetera, et cetera. We deal a bit with that later in the presentation, but the people component was initially very much just, look, we just need to get them remote. We need to keep them active, and we need to make sure that they have enough information and technology and access in order to be able to do their jobs. And then obviously from the processes, they majority of the more successful organizations had the ability to shift it, to smaller teams, shorter decision-making cycles. They broke up the larger projects into smaller chunks. So there's probably going to be a significantly different way of working within large corporates that's going to come from the COVID environment, where they've learned to have more control over projects over the long term at a broader level, but less control over the individual little components of it. So they allow more freedom to the individuals in order to run with the smaller elements and the smaller decisions and the smaller initiatives, but they've got better control over the overall initiative without micromanaging every single part of the engagement. The technical or the IT project management principles aren't particularly good ones to apply to commercial opportunities. I mean, we don't, as management consultants, we also don't use those kind of project management protocols because they way too technical and they're way too detailed. We kind of move between a normal kind of commercial and the technical elements, which is more detailed than the commercial, but less so than the IT. And a lot of the organizations use the consulting type project management protocols in order to run some of the engagements, which work pretty well for them. So the second part of it is the reset strategy, right? So after you've kind of responded and you've stabilized the organization from an operational perspective, it's time to reset the operating model. Now, what is the operating model? The operating model is very much just the model you're operating according to. So when you do target operating model design, it's the model that you target the organization at. So, how much sales, how many people, what's the organizational design, what are the processes associated with it, what are the key performance indicators, the milestones, the targets, et cetera, et cetera. Now, post-COVID or during the COVID period, it was very difficult for organizations to figure out how to right-size the organization. How to make sure that you reset the operating model to be aligned with what you can realistically expect over the next 3 months, 6 months, next year, the next 3 years. And a lot of organizations that we deal with are local divisions of global organizations. So they've got to report back to Europe or to the States or to Asia with regards to what they're going to do from a sales perspective over the next month, the next quarter, the next H1 or H2 or the next year, which makes it very difficult. So it's important to get a good understanding of what is realistically going to be your sales figure. What have you got to work with over the next 6 months, over the next 12 months, over the next 3 years? So as part of that whole refocus process, it's important to reset expectations internally and externally in order to make sure that you're not chasing an unrealistic target. And here is sort of Jesse, just based on that question of yours, this was based on some of Craig's analysis around some of the industries, some of the industries that we think are going to be harder hit. Mining industry, so resources, so manufacturing, obviously, you're taking a bit of a knock at certain elements, automotive, logistics, from a freight perspective, agriculture, agri-processing, right through to obviously certain parts of healthcare being advanced, certain parts of healthcare doing really badly. Elective surgery, certain types of devices doing really badly because of everybody trying to avoid hospitals at the moment, water and sanitation, logistics, ICT. So, depending on which parts of the industry are doing well and how important it is for that particular geography. And just to stress that it's very much geography specific. So it depends on the makeup of those industries within that particular country, what this particular sequence is going to look like. What else do we want to say here? I think that's probably about it. Yeah, so let's move on. So next one is really around the rebound element. And this is where it gets interesting. So this is more the typical sort of bread and butter stuff for us, which is dealing with the growth cycle. So growth cycle, innovation cycle, call it what you want, but it's really about the whole process of identifying opportunities, qualifying them, developing a strategy to take advantage of them, implementing it, monitoring and evaluation, and then feeding it back into the growth pipeline. So in order to meet a target of 5% year-on-year or 10% year-on-year growth, you need a whole range of opportunities feeding into that growth pipeline, because not all of it will pan out. So you need a rebound strategy. So based on what your expectations are of a particular industry or industries and products within those industries, you need to start rebuilding and reconstructing that growth pipeline. Because a very significant proportion of the growth pipelines were pretty much decimated, by COVID. A lot of them don't exist anymore. Some of them, were moved out just from a timeline perspective, so they're longer term, and some of them were brought forward. So if you take a look, say, for instance, at digitization in certain industries like the banking industry, so their timelines for digitization on a lot of their processes were pretty much moved up and halved. So you would have, we were speaking to some of the major banks in South Africa and in Ghana, and some of the digitization initiatives that were planned for a 36-month period have now been brought forward to an 18-month execution period. So because you can't service customers and the banks and the branches anymore, the front end and the back end and the middleware and the core modernization, everything had to happen in a very short space of time. That single view of the customer that the banking industry always talks about, had to happen or has to happen in a very short space of time. They can't wait for 3 years anymore. They've got to do it now. So a lot of those digitalization initiatives had to be brought forward. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the growth initiatives had to be reprioritized. Certain ones that were medium term are now high priority. Certain of the high priority ones have been either deprioritized, or they're now sort of medium term or longer term opportunities. So it's about reevaluating that pipeline, making sure that it's thick and it's strong enough in order to be able to support the organization in the medium and the long term. These growth pipelines don't just mature overnight. So if you start changing tack, you lose momentum, or a significant amount of momentum, which means it takes you a good 6 to 9 months to regain that momentum. And we deal with growth pipelines and innovation pipelines on an ongoing basis. This is the kind of stuff that FROST gets involved in. So it's about understanding the opportunity universe, identifying them sort of based on the remit and the strategy of the organization, qualifying them through good quality commercial analysis. You size them up, you identify the risk elements, the competitive components, the addressable element. You then take a look at how you take advantage of it. So greenfield, brownfield, your positioning, pricing, et cetera, supply chain, value chain, and then you start executing. You do the implementation component, and then you do the monitoring and evaluation part. And it's an iterative cycle, right? So it's not we as consultants and as academics have got a tendency of lineating these things always as linear, but it's very much an iterative process. So quite often you get halfway through, like, bad idea, chuck it, let's start with something new. And then you go through, you're like, yep, good idea, great stuff, so let's go to the next one. So it's an iterative process that you've got to go through in order to make sure that innovation pipeline is strong enough in order to be able to fuel the ongoing growth of the organization. And the biggest threat of this is corporate governance for large organizations. So for small organizations, easy peasy, because you get the senior executives together, they decide yay or nay, and you move on. But for large organizations, the biggest threat to innovation is corporate governance, because trying to get it through the governance structure, the approval processes in large organizations is virtually impossible. In previous life, I used to design these things for large corporates, and we used to spend a good 6 weeks just mapping the approval processes, getting or harvesting a good idea in one part of the business and then trying to get it through to implementation in the other. And we had to get multiple executives into the room in order to run the workshops once a week for 2/3 of a day in order to just map the process, not change it, just map it, to get an understanding of how you get an idea from coal face to topside to HQ to the other mines, and then back to coal face. It's a massive, massive exercise to try to get innovative ideas implemented in any large organization. So if you start changing tack, it's even a bigger issue. So this is a real big problem for organizations, and COVID upset this entire chain. It upset the whole, portfolio value drivers and value opportunities. So a lot of organizations are now going through this process of figuring out, okay, this won't work and this won't work. We have to substitute this and we've got to change that. And this is where a lot of opportunity lies for the consulting industry, I think, going forward. All right, so before we get to the next stage, which is talking specifically about some of the changes in the consulting industry, any questions around the R framework?
We've got a very good question here from Ulrich. Hendrik, if I'm actually going to read it out because it's got good context. Ulrich asks, in terms of the reset phase of your model, it mentions a new commercial context, and I'm keen to understand how far you go in better understanding the deeper underlying societal drivers that have led to current fragilities and instabilities. For example, massive income inequality and destruction of natural resources. These fault lines have become much clearer during the COVID pandemic. Ulrich also says, in the past, management consulting, as most other professional services, has been a major contributor to fostering extreme inequalities by only focusing on improving the lives at the top of the income and wealth pyramid. Do you see this changing?
Oh, okay, so a lot of questions. Sustainability is a really big thing, right? I mean, as part of the changes, and I talk a bit about that later in the presentation, part of the changes in the broader management consulting industry is that the industry will definitely focus more on sustainability, because I think because of the short-term nature of a lot of the engagements in the 80s and 90s and early noughties, the industry has earned a relatively bad reputation, and quite often for good reason. So I think given the pressures that the industry is under at the moment, and most likely the reduction that we're going to face over the next 12 to 24 months, because the industry will contract, I think, quite significantly over the next sort of 12 to 24 months. I think last year, or 2019, it peaked, I think, at about 240 billion. I've got the figure later in the presentation, and we will see a very significant contraction on that number at the global level. We will most likely start asking the right questions and the hard questions with regards to how do we go about doing these things. And I think a lot of clients are also catching on to the fact that they need to start working with organizations that do value sustainability. They need to start dealing with organizations that share a common set of values. And if they don't, they will end up with the possibility of running into the issues that a lot of the premier groups have been running into in South Africa, for instance. I mean, how many of the premier groups have been found guilty of being naughty at multiple levels, doing very stupid things over the past 4 years? And they need to be pulled up on it. I mean, it's just one of those things. If you do the wrong thing, people have got to know about it. And the industry has got to change. The industry has got to change its focus. The sustainability element, I think, the consulting industry is, unfortunately, I think, is a product of clients. If the clients do not prioritize sustainability, I think the consulting industry will most likely change fairly slowly. And it's a commercial element and a commercial focus that needs to change. But I do have a lot of faith in the current generation in order to drive a different set of principles. I mean, we went through quite a significant values change a couple of years ago, and it was quite interesting, sort of going through the process and I guess listening to, especially some of the sort of the more junior individuals, sort of how they think about work and life and business, etc., etc. And I think it's an important shift. I think if you take a look at basic statistics, and we moving off topics slightly, but basic statistics around, say, for instance, volunteerism, in the current generation. I mean, the Generation Y takes a lot of flack, but I mean, they, by far, volunteerism is the highest of any generation, prior to Gen Y. And there's a reason for it, because they take a very different approach to life, and they take a very different approach to sustainability. So yeah, in short, I think corporates are going to change based on the fact that they need to change for employees' sake. In order to provide a good value proposition to the people that they employ, they will have to change tack. They need to change in line with the times. And the management consulting industry will also need to do that. And they'll also need to then sort of address some of the negative aspects in order to make sure that their values and their client values actually align with each other as well. Good stuff.
Thanks. Thank you. Yes.
Good stuff. So let's move on to the next slide. All right. So just talking about sort of some of the changes, I guess, in the consulting industry. And I mentioned this quickly earlier in the presentation, but the consulting industry has been changing. We're doing on time, 45 minutes. All right. It was changing before the COVID crisis. But I mentioned some of the issues that some of the premier groups have been having in South Africa. The KPMGs and McKinseys, et cetera, and they've been caught doing the wrong thing. For the right clients, but I mean for the wrong reasons. So there's been a lot of change already happening in the background, even sort of pre-COVID, and now things are, I think, accelerating. And I think for the industry, the key thing is not to panic, but I mean, never waste a good crisis. The good old Churchill, was rolled out and then rolled back very quickly, just at the right time. And I think, this is the time for the consulting industry in order to change some of its spots. We need to create value for the sake of value. We shouldn't be creating value for any other reason. The sooner we can get over the shock, the sooner we can get stuck into creating new value, new opportunity on behalf of our clients. And we can talk about, what those elements are, what I think some of those elements are that we need to.
All right, now finish it.
Was that a question or?
Manoj, was that a question? No, I think you just unmuted. You can continue.
All right, good stuff. We will most likely see a fair amount of consolidation, I think, in certain segments of the industry. I think the larger players will most likely snap up some of the smaller ones because they've got stronger balance sheets. But I think the overall industry will most likely contract. So we will see a bit of M&A activity, I think, in the short term. In the long term. The short term, everybody's probably going to sort of sit tight and try to figure out sort of which parts of the industry are going to start sort of thriving and start moving up again. But I think in the medium term, we'll most likely see a fair amount of acquisition activity going around as some of the larger groups are going to try to reposition themselves in order to try to take advantage of some of the new opportunities post-COVID. I think the value proposition focused around the elements of respond, reset, and rebound will obviously do well, because I think organizations are looking for value in the new norm, and it's very difficult in certain industries in any case to figure out what that new norm exactly is going to be for their particular industries. So one of the key things is trying to distinguish between short-term inertia versus the longer-term trend. You've got to be able to spot the difference. A lot of the issues that we face in the short term is really just it's disruption. It's because of the crap people have got to deal with, because of the lockdown, homeschooling, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, for those of us with kids, every now and then the video conference doesn't want to work, or we can't download the homework, or we can't do this. My wife was sitting yesterday I think it was literally for about 6 hours, just going through emails and through Teams invites, et cetera, just in order to try to organize the kids for the week ahead. So not doing any physical homework, just organizing it, right? So we've got 2 careers in the house, which means it's quite difficult during the week in order to try to do all of this. So there's a lot of disruption that's happening just because of the physical lockdown and soft lockdown processes. But a lot of that is short term, so as soon as these things are going to start normalizing, we will see some more through normal economic activity, and then some of the more positive elements that are kicking in. And some of the real trends, some of the longer term things that will most likely take forward. So one of the big questions that we get asked a lot is the work from home trend going to continue? And if it does, how does this influence our ability to market to our clients' database, our ability to deliver projects, to our clients, which is quite challenging. I mean, we are busy with the corporate strategy project in one of the neighboring countries in Southern Africa. Now, it's a quasi private public sector institution that we're developing a corporate strategy for. So they've got public sector stakeholders and private sector stakeholders that we've got to appease in order to develop a corporate strategy. Now the question is, I mean, how do we do that? How do we engage them? How do we get them to talk? How do we sort of bring everybody together? How do we do these workshops? Because digital workshops are not particularly working well, you know, when it comes to sensitive topics, et cetera, et cetera. You know, another trend is the continued spike in the shared office space. We moved into a shared office space in sort of 3/4 through 2019. So as part of our rejig and our operating model, we moved to a space where we've got a dedicated seating area, yeah, but the building is managed and operated by a third party, and they take care of everything, the cleaning, the printing, the maintenance, the everything. It is absolute bliss, you know, coming from an environment we had to do the internet and the infrastructure and the servers, et cetera, et cetera. We moved everything into the cloud. We implemented a semi-virtual model, you know, from an office perspective. We implemented a flexible model where certain parts of the week you had to be in the office and certain parts of the week you had option to work from home or work at the office if you wanted to. And when the hard lockdown came, we literally just flipped from a semi-virtual to a full virtual model. Yeah, so for us, it was literally just a smooth transition. All the processes have been adjusted. All the technology platforms have been already been created. Data was accessible to everyone, and the processes and the protocols have already been adjusted in order to make sure that we have enough communication with the staff members in order to make sure projects are looked after, people are looked after, yeah, which was brilliant, right? It was an absolute pleasure, you know, working with the team during that period, because everybody knew that we were quite a fortunate position that we could just continue our project despite the fact that we couldn't physically go to the office. I mean, one of the things that I think will take quite a significant hit in the short term is HR consulting. Yeah, because of the fact that everything is changing at the moment, nobody knows exactly what the outcome is going to be, especially for the larger corporates. But I think in the medium to long term, HR consulting is going to do really, really well. You know, for the simple reason that, you know, with these flexi models and with the remote learning, or sort of the remote operating models, staff engagement is going to be a really tricky thing. You know, trying to motivate and create sort of good culture, you know, cohesiveness in the office, team building, you know, keeping up morale, et cetera, is going to be fairly challenging if you're dealing with a largely remote workforce. Yeah, and things like, you know, traditional marketing consulting will obviously be done. I mean, I remember that we were negotiating with Johannesburg Airport to take one of the billboards, you know, to market, because I mean, our remit is sub-Saharan Africa, so a very significant proportion of our client base move through Joburg Airport, through Addis, and through Lagos. You know, so we were looking at taking billboards in some of the major airports in Africa. But I mean, luckily we didn't sign because of COVID. But I mean, you know, how useless is a billboard airport or a billboard at the airport at the moment? Because I mean, you know, obviously virtually nobody flies at the moment. So yeah, so the key thing in the industry is trying to figure out sort of, you know, from your consulting perspective, I mean, what is short term, what is longer term, and how to position or help position the clients, obviously, you know, to take advantage of some of the opportunities, because every single change, you know, there is an opportunity, you know, that you can take advantage of. There were a couple of questions I think that popped up, Jesse, or
yeah, sure. Can I go ahead and ask you those so long? Are we at that point? Okay, great. Ulrich again. Ulrich, I just want to check if you want to ask these questions yourself, or are you okay for me to read them? Okay. Ulrich says, in terms of industry consolidation, how much are the Big Four impacted by digitization, as we might see traditional services like audit getting more fully automated?
Look, I mean, I can't comment on the audit side. I mean, the audit side is very, I think it's got a very different rhythm to the consulting side. But I mean, there's a tremendous amount of the compliance industries that can be hit extremely hard by digitalization. So compliance, the two of the main industries are the legal industry and the auditing industry, the accounting industry. So with a tremendous amount of digitalization that's happening around those processes, it means that a lot of manual processes, which they charge for, will just happen automatically. So the cost saving associated with something like that would be significant. Just take a look at the cost saving associated from moving, so for instance, something like a pastel to Xero. Massive cost saving, massive time saving. You can access your management accounts, really quickly. It's on demand. You bring down your monthly expenditure by a very significant percentage, without losing even an ounce of quality in the whole process. And that's a small step compared to some of the bigger things that's going to happen longer term. So I think the auditing industry is in for a big change, and so is the legal industry. I had a really interesting conversation. How long ago was this? About 4 or 5 years ago. About 5 years ago, and it was two ladies that set up a legal firm, an online legal firm. And I think they were slightly ahead of the curve at the time. And I'm hoping that they don't. I actually just need to sort of go to the website again. But both of them were big firm lawyers, right? So both of them worked for two of the premier sort of legal firms in South Africa. But they started a family and they didn't want to work the hours, so they set up an online firm with a brand. So it wasn't an independent thing; it was just no association. They set up a brand which was online, and they went around and they sourced other independent lawyers, also sort of big firm or ex-big firm lawyers with really good experience in particular fields. And in each and every single of the major fields, they had 2 or 3 different lawyers that they sourced for this particular platform. But because they didn't have all the infrastructure and they didn't have the baristas sort of serving coffee and canapes every single time a client walked in the front door, and the massive infrastructure, et cetera, of some of the big firms, it means that they could serve the clients at 40% of the price. So you can imagine if you can save 50 to 60% just off the fact that you don't have the large infrastructure. What are you going to do if you can save a significant proportion based on the fact that you don't have to go through all the compliance issues? Because compliance makes up a very significant proportion of legal fees. Still does these days.
Just in line with mergers and acquisitions, there's another question asking along the value chains, when firms like Accenture buy up creative service firms, is this going to happen more in future as creative thinking is less at risk of commoditization? What are your thoughts on that?
I think so. One of the questions that we often get is artificial intelligence in Africa, and is there room for creative thinking, and what role does artificial intelligence play, et cetera. So we ran trials last year on artificial intelligence. We set up a partnership with a company in India that developed an artificial intelligence platform, and they had a fair amount of experience in Southeast Asia and a couple of other places around the world. So we ran the trial in Africa on quite a number of industries. And the challenge in Africa is because of the fact that the gaps in data were so big, the outputs on quite a number of the trials that we ran weren't very good. So it was good in estimating things like sentiment. It was good at taking a look at, say, for instance, political sentiment or sentiment towards particular issues or brands or whatever the case may be. But the challenge is obviously when you start dealing with business to business, you need concrete data, you need information. And the data in Africa that's available is quite often wrong. And the artificial intelligence doesn't necessarily have the ability to spot it because it doesn't have anything to cross-reference it with. So artificial intelligence in Africa is a good 5 to 10 years away from having a significant impact on the continent. And that speaks to your question around the creative thinking component, which is, the creativity element in problem solving and opportunity identification will become a really big thing, I think, going forward. And it's about the facilitation element. It's about bringing a repeatable process to the table that you can enable clients in order to be able to identify opportunities for growth and expansion, and supplement that through the processes that you go through. And I talk a bit about that on the next couple of slides around sort of how Frost does that. But I mean, one of the things I think you'll most likely see is atypical acquisitions, from some of the premier groups with the intention of trying to plug some of those gaps.
Great, thanks. Just one last question before we head to the next section. Do you think we could see a homegrown Pan-African management consulting firm emerge, for example, along the likes of Letsema?
I would very much like that to happen. But I think the likelihood of that happening is, I think, is pretty slim, just because of the lack of budget. I mean, the large firms have got very significant marketing budgets that throw at these opportunities. I mean, having worked for one of the big four audit firms and their consulting divisions, I mean, they've got a very significant amount of money that they can throw at opportunities in the rest of Africa. So, but I'd love to see an Africa-based sort of firm moving up into the rest of the continent, making a big mark, and doing something in Africa for Africa. I mean, nothing would make me happier. I mean, I've got a wild passion for the continent. I've worked and lived in other places around the world, and this is the only place I want to live, and it's the only place I want to work. But I think the chances of that happening in the next, in the foreseeable future, I think is pretty slim, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks.
All right, good stuff. All right, so let's take a look at the next one. Leveraging digital, right? So this kind of speaks to some of the stuff we've already spoken about, but I mean, the digital platforms, unfortunately, is our friend at the moment. I mean, our ability to engage with the clients and run our projects, very much depend on our ability to leverage the digital platforms, communication and other platforms. Your remote and flexible working is definitely here to stay, according to us in any case. I told you what we went through in 2019, and the impact on our operation, apart from trying to maintain staff morale, through the hard lockdown period, because we had quite a few junior staff members that were alone, so they were sitting in a flat essentially, and not sharing flats, so they didn't have necessarily a lot of face-to-face contact with anybody else. We mitigated that by making sure we have people checking in with them on a regular basis. We had regular checkups and check-ins with them, from a senior, from a peer perspective, and then team meetings, etc., etc. But remote and flexible working is definitely here to stay, and you need to make sure you've got the relevant platforms in order to be able to enable that. Employee engagement will change. I think the mental health of employees will take a higher priority. There's a lot of it's a personal, I don't want to call it a pet subject because it sounds like that doesn't sound good, but it's one of the things that have always interested me in terms of employee well-being and how little organizations typically sort of pay attention to it. And I think in this environment, organizations will very quickly realize that if you do not pay attention to employee morale and to mental health, you will most likely end up with a very significantly reduced productive workforce. The onboarding process and the knowledge impartation process can be a massive challenge, especially in the consulting industry, because we rely on these consultants to work with other consultants to impart the knowledge and the understanding. There are some formal training modules and things that we run, et cetera, but a very significant proportion of the learning, you get on the job, you get on the project. So not being able to impart that on a one-on-one basis is a big challenge for us. I haven't been able to solve that. We run quite integrated and highly interactive projects, but we haven't been able to crack that nut just yet. I think more will be also expected from the employee. And I've been on both ends of both sides of the fence, on the employer and on the employee side. And I always feel that, a lot is said always about the employer having to do this and the employee have to do that. But, that responsibility is, I personally feel is equal on both sides of the fence. The employee has got equal amount of responsibility in order to make sure you choose the right company and equal amount of responsibility in order to make sure that you engage enough, in order to make sure that you learn and you get integrated, et cetera, et cetera. You know, COVID or no COVID, from recruitment to exit, it's just as much your responsibility as there is the company's responsibility in order to make sure that you get what you need while you are at the organization. I've had a number of colleagues and a number of employees, with a sense of entitlement, where they need to receive the whole time. If they don't receive the whole time, they become disgruntled and they don't like the organization anymore. I'm going, but what have you done in order to engage? And I think in the post-COVID environment, where a lot of it is going to be remote, you have the freedom to work remotely and plan your own day, et cetera, et cetera. That comes at a cost, and you need to be cognizant of that. And there's a responsibility, from your side in order to make sure that you engage back with an organization. And then you spend enough time with individuals more to make sure that they can impart their knowledge and their understanding to you. So I do think that there's going to be a significant amount of additional initiatives, et cetera, coming from the organizations, but I also think there's going to be more emphasis placed on the individual, engaging more with the organization as well. And that relationship is going to change. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I think over the foreseeable future, I think it's going to be a very exciting time from an HR perspective. But I think watch the space. And in the same vein, the customer engagement will change significantly. Building relationships, change management, etc. It's going to be very challenging not doing that face to face. Collaboration software and hardware, etc. is definitely evolving. I was chatting to one of the hardware providers the other day, and they've got this new piece of kit where it combines telepresence, digital whiteboards, and a whole bunch of other pieces of kit into one. So it's literally, it's a digital whiteboard that you put up, with smart camera technology that literally follows the speaker. Pans in or pans out depending on the audience and depending on who's speaking. As you write on the board, it appears on the board on the other side of the world, wherever you're talking to. They can write on the board as well, and it appears on your side real time. And it's got sort of high definition speakers, and a whole bunch of different things that you can incorporate, and you can cut and paste, and you can have videos playing on the one side, et cetera, et cetera. It's collaboration technology at its finest, and it's being done at a fraction of the price of what you would normally pay in order to combine these various pieces of kit. So we're probably going to see a fair amount of these technologies being rolled out over the next 6 months in order to try to increase the level of collaboration. They're bringing out smaller versions that you can use in your home office, and then the larger versions you'll have physically on the large offices or the executive offices, which will make the collaboration element significantly easier to do. What else? And I think the change management component is going to be really difficult, right? So one of the key things about our industry is that if the customer doesn't believe it's a solution, it's not a solution. You failed. So if you don't get to convince the customer that the recommendation is a good recommendation, then you've essentially failed at the project, because they're not buying into the solution. And the face-to-face interaction helps a lot with that, because they can pick up the sincerity and the passion and the drive around what you've put into the engagement and the data and the process. And it's difficult to get that across over Zoom. You know what I'm saying? We've recently, we're actually still busy wrapping a project in one of the Southern African countries that are on special economic zones. And it's multiple stakeholder groups, so we would literally have to wait for half an hour for the stakeholder groups to join. After they join, it takes another few minutes for everybody to kind of just figure out sort of what needs to be done, and then we start the engagement 45 minutes after the clock. Then the project runs over, and then we get questions about the things we presented, because not everybody was listening while we were presenting. So it's very difficult. You're doing this in an environment where you're not physically in the room, because if you're physically in the room, you can see that parts of the room is not listening. So you can physically walk over there, you can start waving your hands, whatever the case would be, or you can start pointing at somebody, or start speaking loudly, or whatever, in order to try to keep the audience. But I mean, over Zoom, it's very difficult to do that. Yeah, it's very difficult to work the audience, if you don't have a feel for for their reaction and how they're perceiving sort of the recommendations. So it makes the consulting side and the final presentations around the recommendations extremely difficult, because you've got no idea how to read the customer, which means that we've got to put in a significant amount of additional work leading up to that point, dealing with individual stakeholders in order to assess how they perceive the recommendations before we hit the final workshop. So which obviously creates a lot more engagement for us before we actually get to the final session. So the customer acquisition component. So this is an interesting one, right? So the normal way of customer acquisition in the consulting industry is through longer-term relationships, executive relationships, and sort of one-on-one, sort of the partners build relationships, and then at one stage you start talking about a particular opportunity to work together, and that turns into a potential engagement in the project, and then off we go. But because of the lack of engagement with anybody at the moment, really, that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, I mean, Frost bridged that gap quite a long time ago by leveraging the market intelligence side of the business. So they leverage the content that they develop by giving insight first, creating the platform to have a conversation with some of the senior executives, and then talking to them about how to respond to what we just presented. So we would present on a particular opportunity or a particular dynamic in the industry, or how we think the industry is going to change, or what's going to happen post-COVID, or whatever the case may be, whatever is relevant. And then we would have a conversation around what is their planned response to that particular element. But we would add value first, and then we would start engaging with the customer around potential engagement. And during the whole hard lockdown and the few weeks thereafter, where our clients were very much in crisis mode, I mean, we put out a tremendous amount of free content. We had oodles of conversations with clients, just taking them through RRR, taking them through some of the research that we published around what's going to happen, and what is COVID, and how it's going to influence the industry, and how it's going to influence South Africa and the rest of the continent, et cetera, with the intention of making sure that the clients actually see that we serious about adding value. And it goes back to that ethics element, the question that I think Ulrich sort of asked earlier around, the ethics of the industry, and sort of how do we go about making sure that it's not just about chasing the next dollar. The overall ethos of Frost & Sullivan Africa is helping Africa grow, and that's the tagline that we use. So when we have our value sessions, when we talk about the initiative that we're going to take on for the year, that is at the top right-hand corner of everything that we do, helping Africa grow. And that's what we do. If it doesn't fit that, we don't do it, right? That's why we get up in the mornings. If it doesn't fit into making sure that the continent actually advances, we don't do it. We don't prioritize it. And I'm hoping that there will be significantly more consulting organizations that take that approach, where they say, look, we've got to have a bigger calling, right? We've got to have a bigger picture idea of why we get up in the mornings and why we do what we do, because they're good at what they do. The management consulting industry is, attracts some of the brightest and some of the best individuals in academia, etc. But quite often it's not necessarily sort of applied right. And I'm hoping that over the foreseeable future, as the industry starts changing, it changes for the better. And we start applying some of these principles to what we do and how we do it in a more responsible and a more ethical way. The customer acquisition thing is definitely going to be a big challenge for us. But I think people generally have more working hours available to them because they commute less, and we've got to use those hours. And the way that we use those hours is by making sure that we give value. We give them content, we organize webinars, and we make sure that we provide the context and the understanding, and we create the platform for the conversation to say, right, so if you enjoyed this, we can do so much more. If this is something of interest, if you think that this added real value, imagine what we can do over a 3-month engagement or a 6-month engagement for you. And then people are open to have the conversation, right? Because I mean, they realize that we're serious about the relationship. And we often say to them, we're not going anywhere, you're not going anywhere. So, we've been here for the last sort of 15, 16 odd years. You are one of our major clients in terms of focus. So, if you don't have anything now, that's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. But if there is something, then great stuff. We'll continue feeding you with some inputs and some good quality intelligence up until the point that we can start helping you with one of your initiatives, which I think serves them well and serves us well. All right, next up, innovative business models and partnerships. I think what we're probably going to see is a greater degree of focus, from some of the organizations. I think, the whole jack of all trades thing, you will most likely, I'm hoping will start fading, because, especially some of the larger premier groups have got a tendency of hoarding everything, trying to do all these projects all by themselves, which is not great. So they're going to have to start playing nicely with other kids. They have a very nasty tendency of sometimes stealing the smaller kids' lunch when they start collaborating, which is not good. So I think more collaboration, more partnerships. And based on what is best for the client. It was one of the principles that we've taken to the African environment, is we will partner with organizations that will ensure that we deliver great value to the client. So over the past year, we've collaborated, I think, on probably a good sort of 6 or 7 different projects with other consulting companies. Anything from town planners to engineering firms to other consultancies to other market intelligence firms, in order to deliver the value that we need to our clients. And that's what happens when you put your client first. And we have the frank conversation up front to say that, look, we will not steal your client. We will not take over the relationship. It's your client. You brought the lead to the client, or vice versa. We brought the lead to the client or to the table. It's our relationship, and you won't interfere with that relationship. We brought the opportunity to you. You'll have the opportunity to work with the client, but please don't steal the client, because otherwise that's the last opportunity you'll have to work with us. For us, it's typically, it's a pretty well-known international brand, so we quite often have the upper hand and the ability to steal the clients. So it's up to us to act ethically and make sure that we don't squash the little guy. We don't squash the independent consultants. And the independent consultants like working with us, because we don't. We take an ethical approach to our engagements, to our projects, and I think our clients are better off for it. Whether it's a relationship that brings us to the table, or whether it's a skill set that brings us to the table, it doesn't really matter. I also think that a larger contingent of the workers will be flexible in the consulting environment. So we'll definitely see a smaller amount of people being directly employed, and a larger proportion being flexible, people with specialized skills, sort of working most likely across firms and avoiding too much bench time. We work with a fair amount of consultants, people that worked for Frost in the past and now to work independently, and they work a proportion of their time for Frost. We've got a brilliant financial modeler that we work with on a regular basis. We've got 2 projects working with him at the moment. And he does excellent work. I wouldn't want anybody else to work on my financial modeling projects, but he doesn't work for us permanently. That's fine. We don't need to have that skill in-house all the time, because I can't keep him busy 365. So I think a larger contingent of flexible workers in the consulting space, I think, is inevitable. All right, so where will we find the opportunities, or where are some of these these larger opportunities? I think we've spoken about some of them, but I think radical intelligence, so ability to distill the noise and pare down to the essence. There's a lot of noise out there. Everybody's got access to so much content that it's very difficult sometimes to figure out what is real and what is not. What is a real opportunity, and what is just talk. We've spoken about AI and the fact that I think it's only going to be relevant in Africa in the 5 to 10 year mark. radical opportunities of finding the right balance, I think, between, especially in Africa, between opportunity and investment and risk. There's in Africa, more often than not, companies have got a tendency of overestimating the opportunity and underestimating the growth and underestimating the brand loyalty. So they move into a market, they think, oh, great stuff, we've got this amazing product, it's superior to all the local products that are available, and customers are just going to kind of stream in the front door and just start buying it. But I mean, Africa has got a very strong brand memory. And they go for the brands that they know, because they know that they can get spare parts. They know that the company has been there for a number of years, and they know that there's a loyalty to the particular market. So they're not that keen to switch brands, when new companies move in, because they've seen their fair share of companies moving in and then moving out in a relatively short space of time. So that opportunity in Africa needs to be balanced with the investment. So making sure that you don't overinvest, you don't create a burning platform, but you don't underinvest, sort of creating competitive risk, and you time that up with the addressable opportunity over time, or to make sure that the opportunity is well timed, well directed, and you balance the sort of the short term and the long term opportunities. So radical business models, so industry changing models, without losing quality. So you're providing customers, I think, with greater flexibility. I think if there's one thing that we'll see coming out of COVID is a requirement for shorter term contracts, more flexibility, being able to move up or move down faster. And I think in the real estate market, gone are the 5-year leasing contracts for offices and that kind of thing. Because I mean, frankly, you can predict what your requirements are going to be in 5 years' time. So customers will require a greater degree, I think, of flexibility, so that everything is the service models. So operationalizing some of the capital expenditure, I think, will be really, really big. And then more outcome-based work in the consulting industry. So you deliver the value and we'll pay you a fee, or a proportion of the value that you deliver will most likely also increase. So we definitely had an increased level, or a number of organizations asking us whether we'll be willing to work on risk. Our game is a bit difficult to do it because the cycles are quite long, and the influencing factors are quite broad, which is quite often so out of our control. But I do expect a significant proportion of the consulting industry moving to a more risk model or an outcome-based model. And then value-based pricing, right? So it's the consulting industry has got a tendency of doing time-based pricing as opposed to value-based pricing. So I think we're probably going to move to the latter, where the client's going to take a look at the value that we bring as opposed to the time it's going to take in order to be able to get to that point. And sometimes the differences are subtle, but the clients are smart, right? So I mean, we recruit from the same talent pools. So I think it's most likely going to make quite a significant move towards the latter. And then just the knowledge commoditization. Everybody's got access to the theory. It's about your experience, about how do you apply it. I think business science in itself is not necessarily all that complicated. It's about how you apply it. It's your experience in the market and how you apply it. That essentially at the end of the day makes the big difference. The theory behind your business is not necessarily all that complicated. The experience, especially in a place like Africa, about how you apply it and what is relevant and what is not in the local context and local understanding, I think makes a very significant difference, and to largely determines whether you're successful or not in Africa. And then just the final couple of words before I hand over to Jesse to curate the questions. I mean, the consulting industry, I think, will definitely contract. I think currently it's 240, 250 billion US dollars big. It's the last figure, I think, in 2019 or something. So we'll definitely see a contraction in the industry. It will become more focused and more flexible, and I think more will be focused on the value adding component as opposed to sort of the input pricing, sort of the time and materials type pricing. I think it's a tough time, most likely, for many firms, but I think it's a good time to ask the tough questions. The tough questions around value, around ethics, et cetera, et cetera. The industry, like I said, and especially in South Africa, is coming out quite a tough era, because of the mistakes that some of the premier groups have made. So it's a good time for us, I think, to kind of reflect and just question, our own ethics and the way and the reason why we do certain things. But I think it's good. I think, hopefully the strong will survive, and hopefully the ones that do survive, will adhere to a better set of principles, going forward. All right, that's the prezi, guys. Stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Hendrik. I just want to check if anybody in the audience wants to ask a couple of questions directly before I go to the questions raised in the chat.
I would please. Hi there, Jesse. Thank you. Thank you, Hendrik, for a very insightful presentation. Peter Biekus here from MediClinic International. Just a quick question. I recently engaged with consultants in Switzerland who were giving us advice in our Swiss business, and found that the background of the services were a little bit there wasn't a lot of healthcare background. I mean, boots on the ground type of insight. How does Frost & Sullivan recruit for these specific clients in healthcare? And also, what else do you offer in your specific focuses in Southern African market?
Sure. So the ideal candidates, for an industry like healthcare, so there are a number of industries that you can recruit, like a general background, right? So I mean, if you're recruiting for the energy industry, you can recruit somebody with a commercial background. If you recruit somebody for the industrial sector, that's absolutely fine, also with the automotive industry. But I mean, if you talk about industries like information and communication technology, chemicals, healthcare, you ideally want somebody with a fairly strong understanding of the industry and the fundamentals of the industry. So we would typically look at somebody with at least an academic background in the industry. So, either studied pharmaceuticals, physiotherapy, occupational therapy. We've had pharmacists, we've had medical doctors working for us, et cetera, so they bring a good understanding of the structure of the industry, and also they bring the lingo to the table, because I think a lot of times you kind of lose credibility because you just don't speak the language. It's the same thing in the ICT industry. If you don't speak the language, you immediately lose credibility. So within the executive team, just speaking the language already makes quite a big difference, and just making sure that you kind of keep the conversation in hand, even before you get to recommendation stage. So the healthcare team, predominantly is made up of individuals with some kind of healthcare background from an academic perspective, or it's individuals that have been working on the research side of the healthcare industry for a long period of time, and then we move them across to the consulting side of the business. From a focus perspective, so we work on 3 aspects of the healthcare industry, actually 4 aspects of the healthcare industry: pharmaceuticals, devices, healthcare infrastructure, so hospitals and clinics, and then healthcare IT. So those are the 4 main areas that we focus on. We've done feasibility studies for hospital infrastructure in East Africa, and if I'm not mistaken, in West Africa as well. We've done a fair amount of device and pharmaceutical studies, East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa. We do a lot of work globally on healthcare IT, although we've done dotted projects in Africa, because I mean the majority of the projects are not sort of high-tech healthcare IT type stuff. It's either basic devices or pharmaceuticals that we would do, and sometimes a couple of niche areas like sleep therapy and that kind of thing that we would look at as well. So my healthcare projects are predominantly delivered by one of 2 teams, and that would depend on the specific clients and or product areas that we focus on. So I've got a team in Dubai and India, and I've got a team in the UK that service my African projects. And both those teams have got in excess of 12 or 15 projects already executed in Africa on Africa. So they're fairly well versed, and they've been working in and on the continent, I think, at least for the last 4 to 5 years.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you for that answer.
Good stuff. Good stuff. But man, to kind of ask the underlying question, I mean, I agree with you. I think the underlying requirement to have somebody with a baseline knowledge of the industry, I think, is important. I think certain industries, it doesn't phase you that much. It's not a big thing. Yeah, but certain industry like healthcare and ICT and chemicals, I mean, you need somebody with a really good understanding of the sector.
Great,
Good
thanks.
stuff. Next up.
I'm cognizant of time, so I just want to share this question from Michelle. Key thoughts on critical customer retention risks? Any pearls of wisdom to maintaining relationship growth with key customers that you can no longer see face to face?
Buy them wine.
Well, we couldn't for the longest time, Hendrik. I mean, that was the problem.
You needed to stock up beforehand and then say, crikey, the customer retention thing. Look, it's the customer journey is a really big challenge, right? I mean, I know that, Frost in the US has got a fair amount of experience in the customer experience thing. I know there was a webinar that they hosted not too long ago, so I might dig out that webinar for you and maybe send you the link. I'm the wrong guy to speak to with regards to customer experience, but I do think that the customer journey is going to change quite significantly. Right? So, what we would typically do is we would map out the key points of communication with the customer from initial communication to through the business development cycle, and then through to execution, et cetera, and then we would design the messaging for each and every single point of communication and the channel and the platform and all the rest of the stuff, right? So we would take a fairly rigorous process and approach in order to design that process. But the challenge these days is just trying to access them in the first place. I don't know about you guys, but I get so many bloody LinkedIn messages about the most unrelated products that people want to sell me and projects that people think that I should be interested in, and it's exactly what I need. I'm going like, man, it's just, you clearly didn't read my profile, because it's not even remotely what we do. But so we've got to find ways of distilling and cutting through the noise, by being absolutely relevant. You're brutally honest, and just cutting through all the checks. But I don't have too many pearls of wisdom at this particular point in time. We are trialing a number of things. We've taken over our own customer relationship management platform, so we don't use the Frost Global one anymore. And we're programming it and slicing and dicing it in very different ways. We are trialing different graphical forms on social media, for instance. So we've trialed different ways of depicting information and different posts in order to take a look at what gets more hits. It's the same data and the same information, but the way that you represent it makes quite a big difference. So we've toyed around with videos, with infographics, with text, with radical headings, with softer headings, with data-driven headings, et cetera, in order to figure out sort of what hits. So what works in our industry won't necessarily work in your industry. But I think the point is just you need to be as creative as physically possible in order to run different trials, in order to figure out what works. How do you engage? And also don't be misled by just the number of hits. It's about who actually looks at it. It doesn't help a bunch of students look at it, or a bunch of unrelated businesses sort of open up the link. It's got to be your clients, right? So you've got to analyze the statistics. And that's not a system-based thing. You're going to have to open it up, and you're going to have to look through the profiles and take a look at who's actually sort of looking at it in order to figure out if it's worthwhile or not. Frost puts out a tremendous amount of content, which makes it relatively easy for us in order to run these kind of trials. So the guys that subscribe to us, or that follows us on some of the social media platforms, know that we put out a tremendous amount of good, solid, sort of quite informative content, which makes it quite easy for us to trial this. But yeah, I think that would be my advice, is just to try to be as creative as physically possible across the channels that you do use.
Great, thank you very much. We are now out of time, so I would like to ask Tammy to just wrap our session here and leave us with the final contact details. Tammy, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Hendrik, JC, and Michelle. I'll be posting on the chat window for anything Frost and Sullivan, for career opportunities, or to inquire more about Frost and Sullivan. There's an email that will be there. There's the landline, and also we'll be posting their LinkedIn page. So it should appear everyone to everyone now in the chat. But thank you for the insightful conversation. Really grateful to to have had some insights, especially from CEO, for having taken your time off your calendar to to share your wisdom. I'm really looking forward to engaging more with you, and I'm sure there are quite a few that will be looking forward to actually engaging, just to see what it is that they can do from a career perspective, or probably from a services perspective. But thank you so much. We appreciate everyone for attending. This is our first event to kick off the year. A few more in the pipeline, and we'll be sure to have to see all your faces again. It's been an insightful evening, and until the next time, it is thank you from us, USB Consulting Club. Hendrik, hopefully we will be able to send you something before Begekwele starts arresting us again. As a token of our appreciation. But yeah, from us at the USB Consulting Club, we really appreciate your time, and to all our participants for this evening. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. It's always a pleasure sort of dealing with the USB Consulting Club, and thank you very much for all the work that you guys do as well. It's a pleasure sort of seeing all the work that goes into making sure that the industry also gets some exposure. So we love giving back to the sector. So thanks a lot for the opportunity. We really appreciate it, and all the best. I think it's tough times for a lot of people, and at multiple levels. Whether it's homeschooling, or whether it's your own business going through a tough time, or the company that you're working for, or the company that you're not working for at the moment. And all the best. We hope that all the future plans and things work out. So all the best to everybody. Thanks for your time and attention. It's been a pleasure.
Also,
thank you so
for any
much.
queries regarding the consulting club, USB Consulting Club at usb.ac.za. I've posted the email in our chat. Thank you.